how do you see not going down the path that every other fledgling social democratic party went through and ended up where they are, today?
Yeah. Good question. I wish I wish I could tell you I have 1, 2, 3 and I have a prescription for that. I don't. One thing that we would like to start working on is how do you control your elected representatives? Now, one of the things I would like to do is develop structural means of controlling the parliamentary wing. Up to now, the way it's done is that the party executive controls their work on a daily basis, which is fine and good. We've been insisting that at either meetings, at either congresses of the party, conventions of the party, or when we have the meetings of what we call our national coordinating body, that it be a report, a formal report, tabled by the members of parliament, which they've begun to do. What we would like to do, the left elements, the eco-socialist network, what we would like to do is not only have a report, but have a report that is voted on. Of course, some people see exactly what that means, because when you ask for a report by the parliamentary fraction and you ask for a vote, obviously the possibility of a sanction exists. But I think this is something that we have to move towards, developing a structural means of being able to control the parliamentary work. And that is not going to be an easy thing, but I think it's an important debate, and we're on the verge of beginning that debate. Now, once you go beyond that, what are the other means that can be developed apart from a structural control or an attempt at structural control of your elected membership? I think the chapters, the constituencies have a role. The regional organizations have a role. And I think the left-wing collectives inside the party have a key role there. I mean, we're lucky enough to have, if not fractions allowed in Quebec Solidaires, but at least collectives have been allowed since 2007. Now that took quite a struggle, because when the party was formed in 2006, collectives were not allowed. It took about a year to fight and have the principle of having collectives organized around political issues. So now there's a collective, which is the Communist Party of Quebec. There's a collective, Gauche Socialiste, which is affiliated to the Fourth International. There's a Marxist International Tendency Collective. There's Socialist International Collective. There's an ecological collective. There's a women's collective. There's a collective on secularism. And it's all kinds of, there's about 8 or 9 different collectives. So it's become acceptable to have those in the party, but they do not have any particular weight in the structure. They have the right to speak, but they do not have delegates, or they do not have a specific way of interacting with the decisions. Hopefully, what we can do is not necessarily through demanding a seat at the table. I don't think in the conditions of Quebec we can move towards that kind of representation, which is accepted in Europe, but which we have not seen in Quebec. But we can at least make sure that through the network that we have begun to establish, that we have a continual criticism, positive and sometimes negative, of the leadership, and develop this kind of tradition of questioning the leadership. Now, we've been lucky because we've been able to defeat the leadership on one issue. I mentioned that, the potential alliances with the Parti Québécois in 1 or 2 ridings. But it shows that you can beat the leadership on some issues, and it creates a certain amount, I think, of carefulness by the leadership. I don't know what else we can look at in terms of structural measures, you know. I mean, if people know of such things and they have heard of such mechanisms, such ways, I'd like to hear about it, but I don't know many more.
Okay, thanks, Roger. It's extremely informative. I'm looking forward to the day when we're going to have the problem of how we control our elected delegates anti-neoliberal formation of some sort. But in the meantime, some of us have thought that we will be able to start influencing people towards anti-capitalism through the ecological battles that are necessary, and specifically pairing those with the concept of socialism. So like the Eco-Socialist Network, we've formed a small group here. And we've been in contact, in fact, with some of the people from your group. But what I'd like to know, and what I hope you can tell all of us here, is to what extent, you mentioned a little bit that there was a judgment that this kind of work should be done at the municipal level. But to what extent are you looking at social layers in society where it's particularly fruitful to do it? We have a major problem with getting anything through to the trade union movement that could possibly get out of hand and lead to radical action that might somehow influence the next election and make it difficult to get the NDP elected, although the aspirations to do that remain, even though the benefits of it are clearly diminishing. Anyway, but also, I mean, obviously you said this, recruiting all of these students, that you specifically put the timing of forming the Eco-Socialist Network together with recruiting all these students is something that they would do. So could you just elaborate a little bit on what layers of society and how you're approaching this question in terms of radicalization and recruitment?
Of course, the student movement was extremely important because we just went through an incredible strike and mass mobilization. And a lot of these activists learned a tremendous amount about strategy and tactics of leading a mass movement. I think the other level has been the trade unions. And with the trade unions, we've been able to develop quite interesting work with a lot of public sector unions. A lot of the young activists end up working more or less as trade union organizers, you know? And so gradually, since we've had 2 student strikes in Quebec for the past 10 years, one in 2005 and this one in 2012, you do have some activists which have come out and begin working either in the community movement or quite a few of them in the trade union movement. So in the trade union movement, there's a growing audience for Quebec Solidaire. We're beginning to rally people a lot, I would say, at the Labor Council level and public sector level. The private sector is a bit more difficult. And I think that's where the Eco-Socialist Network can play a role. If we agree as workers, as members of the working class, as members of the trade union, that we have to go beyond the present system, that we have to find a way of not harming the planet, of developing renewable energies, of developing green jobs, let's see how mines would be run under such a system. What do we do with the oil exploration? And in this way, create the conditions where you can have a debate with private sector unions and bring them into the movement. So if eco-socialism is used intelligently, and I think it could establish the ways to approach and begin the debate with private sector unions on these issues. Particularly, I'm referring to the question of the pipeline, which is a very difficult issue to discuss. And this is something that we're going to try and apply over the next year in moving towards the People's Social Forum. I mean, we're planning to have a People's Social Forum with mass labor participation from across Canada in Ottawa at the end of August. And what we're proposing to the trade unions is to organize a whole gaggle of workshops on all kinds of issues, what it is to organize in the 21st century, how do you organize among non-traditional sectors, but also organize workshops on the question of the environment and the working class, the environment and trade unions. What is a true green policy and how do you move beyond the present economic paradigm based on fossil fuels? And these are places and issues and spaces where you can begin this debate. At least I hope so.
You touched on saying that the first past the post system is incredibly difficult for small left parties. Has there been any discussion within Solidaire or the network around electoral reform?
Oh yes, oh yes. It's part of the platform since 2006, proportional representation.
Proportional.
Oh yeah, yeah. But I mean, there's no hope in hell it's going to be accepted by any of the major parties in Quebec. Actually, the party that would have a vested interest in adopting that is the Liberal Party, because their vote is concentrated around Montreal and going west from Montreal to the Ottawa border, to the border with Ontario. And so the party that would have the most vested interest would be the Liberals. But you see, accepting proportional representation would be for the Liberal Party of Quebec, accepting the fact that they'll never get a massive support among the Francophone voters. So they can't do that because it's an open admission of defeat as far as the Francophone voters go. So politically, they cannot do that. The PQ, it's the exact opposite. They have such a hold on the Francophone voters in Quebec that moving towards proportional representation does not help them. On the contrary, it might hinder them and might hand power to the Liberal Party. So none of these two parties have any interest at this time moving towards proportional.
What kind of campaigning?
So I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it's, you know, you're up against such vested interests that unless you end up getting yourself close to a majority, I don't see how you can change that system. But I'm not against it, on the contrary. We are trying to push it municipally. There's people are trying to push it at the municipal level and then use that as a wedge towards the provincial level.
The 8 bonus questions there, one of them was the engaging electoral politics.
Yeah.
And as I've gotten older and moved from the idea of revolution, what was going to happen, and started to realize where we actually are, it seems like there's no other alternative but to engage in electoral politics. It seems to me no other way than to either work within one party or another, I mean here it's only the NDP, or form another party which provides an alternative to the NDP. And that's kind of where my 62 years have gotten me.
Well, I had that same discussion in Halifax back in early August. I was invited to speak in Halifax by a group called Halifax Solidarity, which is a left-wing collective in Halifax. And they asked the same questions, and actually they were debating whether they were going to support the NDP or not in the provincial election, which just happened right now. And I think one of the elements that they brought up, that even though they think that at one point a clean break with the NDP is necessary and important, maybe it wasn't the right time, but they wanted to look at the possibility of running a left-wing slate municipally. And then through that experience, begin looking at doing electoral work, but in a different way. Not in a way that is traditional with the NDP, but trying to have some kind of an electoral front or a left-wing front that would run municipally in Halifax, that would actually try and bring in the community group, try and bring in the social movements on the municipal scene, and not just individuals running in the name of this or that party. So I'm not saying that the discussion has gone very far, but it's interesting to see that this issue of what do? Do you break with the NDP? Don't you break with the NDP? Is it possible to launch and start some form of a left-wing party that could run either municipally or provincially, is beginning to be looked at. So I do hope that in some fashion, some way, that over the next few years, some form of networking is developed so you can have contacts and exchange from Halifax to Vancouver, Toronto, etc. And then us, Quebec activists, can have somebody to talk to, you know? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Changing electoral rules and tactics from first past the post to single transferable vote or party proportionality, proportional representation, only legitimize the transferring of legislative power from all the people, all the citizens, to just few political representatives. Some participants on Nowpolling.ca want to shift the legislative power here on provincial government and Ministry of Public Administration, Minister Mandate. They want to shift not just from one political party to another political party, but from all politicians of all parties to all the people, all the citizens of Canada. Legislation can always be done by referendum. You can participate with your own initiative on Nowpolling.ca.
If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Nowpolling.ca.
Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.